Is there a time that you have felt as an ordinary citizen that you feel like you are a bleeding cow that is being milked? Is there a time as a business where you have felt that things are not going to change? Good evening, I'm Catherine Mugaga. Tonight on the program, we are joined by the Chief Executive Officer of the Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Christopher Mugaga. Mr. Mugaga, good evening and welcome to the program.
Thank you. Pleasure is mine. Thank you for the invitation.
Sure.
Thank you.
This week, a number of people were pleasantly surprised. And I would say that extended to businesses too, when the authorities announced a raft of measures that were centered on tax reductions as well as statutory, obligatory, and administrative costs that business had complained of in the last couple of months. As business, are you happy with the latest cocktail of measures?
Oh, yes, my brother. I think it's a step in the right direction, especially given the debilitating effects of the regulatory burden, which had been defining the whole business landscape of the country. I think if you were to just see numbers in terms of how much it costs to produce a unit of good, you will see where it is costing an average of about 15 to 18 cents in South Africa. The cost on average for Zimbabwe was northwards of 90 cents for the same product, just different processes and different tax sets may be applying. So we can certainly see it as a very necessary but not necessarily sufficient step, but it is a very necessary step. I can liken the stance which government has just taken is that of someone who is in a marriage setup. For a husband married to a beautiful woman, you can't violate or beat her up. But it doesn't mean if you don't beat her up, it will strengthen the marriage. You also have to incentivize the marriage for it to work beyond just stopping beating it up. So the taxes were as good as a case of a cannon beating up business. By removing them, you are setting almost a fair ground. But what is needed are different policy interventions, and interventions have to come timelessly for the whole business environment to remain conducive or to be competitive to surrounding countries and even the global village.
Mm-hmm. So, where you would want to see sufficiency, at what stage would you say that we are going to see that sufficiency that you so desire as business?
I think there is no precise formulae to define the epitome of what you can say is the optimal environment. But what is more important, firstly, is to make sure that when you introduce the tax measures, levies, fees, and even other interventions like the interest rate policy, you have to look at the fundamentals within the economy and also look at the worries of the business sector, not forgetting also labor, which is the employee in the economy, and also the common man in the street, which is the consumer. So we can't necessarily put a mark to say there's a time when we hit the peak of what we call possibly an optimal policy environment. What we need to shun or stop maybe is sometimes what we had witnessed as the government pace in dealing with malfunctioning economy. The pace looked like it will be slow, very slow, and coming to a halt. So the trick doesn't lie just in intervening by slashing the costs. The trick lies in monitoring the economic environment and tweak it to know what needs to be adjusted upwards, what needs to be adjusted downwards, in line with the vision of pushing the gross domestic product. So that's why I'm saying a very necessary, but certainly not a very sufficient move, because what will push the business or the cost of doing business in the economy, it goes beyond these levies. There's no one who tackled corruption so far. And as Chamber of Commerce, if we look at our figures, we believe that for every $1 cost of producing goods in the economy, the levies were contributing almost 20-25 cents, with the remainder or the residual amount being related to possibly the bribes, the corruption. And corruption will not certainly be levied or slashed rather, but you need a robust, independent judicial system which will be able to tackle the menace of corruption. For corruption remains one of the biggest challenges, because even after removing all the levies, the risk you run is if corruption remains rearing its ugly head, it will defeat, it will reverse the whole gains which are expected to come from this move rather.
Okay. So when you speak of having an independent judicial body that should deal with corruption, are we saying that the Chapter 12 institutions such as the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission is not done enough, it needs a lot of teeth, or it is toothless?
I think dealing with corruption in any economy, it is a menace which cannot be solved by an institutional approach. Firstly, obviously, is the value system of the country, but also the consequence management. Once you become corrupt, you have to appreciate that there are consequences. If you go to jurisdictions like China, in Africa you go to Rwanda, you know very well what it means if you're corrupt. You don't need an institution like an anti-corruption commission body because it's run by human beings like you and I. But once you create that robust judicial system, it transcends and goes beyond the institutions like Chapter 12 institutions they are referring to. So it is prosecution and successful prosecution of corruption cases which should send the shivers to those who will be corrupt to know that there are consequences to it. So corruption is an issue which business will continue bemoaning. But this is not to downplay the interventions which we had just witnessed through cabinet announcements rather, where you saw a number of taxes slashed. But now it's also a duty of government to see to it that after announcing these slashes, will it be business as usual, even for government finances? If it is business as usual, then also it has to be unfortunate to the ear of a businessman to say, but for something which was costing $500 if it was a number plate, if you had to slash it to $50, surely, and if the consequences, or if government is not to feel the pinch after reducing the amount by $450, what was happening to the $450? So it is that level of transparency which will be needed. If you go to Argentina, for example, at one point I noticed that you go to a gas station, which you call a service station, to fuel a vehicle. When they give you a receipt arguing that, for example, per liter gasoline or fuel costs $1.40, the receipt will have a whole build-up written of the type of taxes which contributed to the amount you see. So it is also transparency which we need going forward. Not just otherwise we'll build another new leg of taxes, and after 4 years we'll be in the same position because government will be under strain to raise money, to pay civil servants, raise money, to involve itself in infrastructure projects, raise money, and also to create the reserves which you know are needed if ever you are to contemplate having your own currency.
You took words out of my mouth, but I'm glad that the only words that I was left with are to say that let's talk more about this after the break. Please join us in the second segment as we discuss the latest measures by the government as well as what should happen going forward, particularly as we head towards the 2026 national budget. Welcome back. This week on the program, we are in discussion with the Chief Executive Officer of the Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Chris Mugaga. Mr. Mugaga, we were talking about these taxes, and obviously we're raising the issues that have to do with transparency and confidence building. I would like to take you back. We have seen the levels of slashing that has been done to these taxes and other costs that are weighing down businesses and also affecting ordinary citizens. So can we say that these actions, they speak to the fact that Zimbabwe can actually deal with where we are now? Those taxes were not necessary.
To say the taxes were not necessary maybe will be underplaying the undercurrents regarding especially the fiscal pressures which the present government has to deal with. For example, if you were to talk to a business in insurance in Zimbabwe, a business in construction, I think you hear time and again cases where contractors were not paid on time. You had cases where, for exporters who had surrendered their proceeds, the surrender, 30% has not been coming. You had cases where even insurance companies, after deductions of the premiums through SSB, the funds will not flow to the insurance companies. That's an undercurrent of the precious fissures, which are definitely somehow bagging the fiscal position of the nation. I think what is more significant going forward is how does government close the hole that has been created through slashing these levies, because some of these levies are the reason why some regulatory bodies are still in existence, which means they have to look beyond the usual cheap, convenient source of funding which they used to rely on. So we cannot necessarily say it was not necessary. I think what is more important is to appreciate that when government take these move or measures, they have to acknowledge and appreciate that there is no economy where administrative interventions, in particular just thinking of having a tax head, will push an economy. Because a tax role is not necessarily just to raise revenue for the government. It is to equalize economic activity. It is also even to be used to incentivize players who wants to come in through FDI. But once you continue or start relying on taxation as a source of revenue, it creates its own challenges. So the move which has just been taken, it can be toxic if it is not controlled in a way where the alternative revenue sources will be found. But the best way to push the alternative revenue sources is to allow for increased GDP growth, for businesses to blossom. And once they blossom, they widen the tax base. And once the tax base is widened, you can see that government will even run away from the fiscal deficits, which had been quite imminent of late. So I personally can't say the recent move means that all the money which was collected was not necessary. Possibly if the money had been utilized for key projects or for key reasons which will assist business, assuming that a fund was created where every business under strain will be able to access that fund, possibly the story will be different. But the reason why we feel the cost-benefit analysis was not favoring business is after taking the tax, there was no incentive whatsoever to remain in business within the local environment. And we hope after government slash, we don't have a leg of new pseudo-taxes. They might not come as those levies, but they will come to plug the hole which we need to fight against.
Yeah, I was actually going to go there and say the minister in August at the Daily News post-midterm budget breakfast meeting, he said that he was going to look into removing some of these taxes and revising downwards some of the taxes like the IMTT, and also look at the tax thresholds when he unveils the 2026 national budget in November. So do you believe that he's walking the talk because he's just done that? Do you believe he's walking the talk, and do you think that what he's done portends good things to come the unveiling of the 2026 national budget?
Yeah, I think what is happening currently come the 2026 national budget, these measures are certainly going to preempt whatever you can expect. Then after 2026, what we only possibly expect is alignment of the finance bill to look at the new normal, a new normal where regulatory bodies will not rely on such usurious tax heads and levies which had been inflicting a lot of pain to businesses. But looking at IMT, for example, I think if you look as business, in particular Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce, we have never at any point felt it was a good tax head. I think we described it as a toxic tax head. And it's unfortunate that after engagement at that breakfast meeting you're referring to with the Treasury boss, he hinted on somehow restructuring or relooking at the structure of the IMT as a tax head. But to us, we felt it's a tax head which has to be completely eradicated or removed. given the consequences or the unintended consequences, if I'm to be very much particular on that, not only to an ordinary citizen, but even to financial service sector. I believe even if you were to talk to a rational banker, they will tell you that 2% for every transaction can only create that level of financial disintermediation, which will not incentivize anyone to come to a bank to save. Every time you think of informality in the economy, it's an incentive to be informal because it's a short way for you to shun the 2%. Then outside that, you can also look at the different provisions. We have been looking to what we call the provision, Section 4A of the Finance Act, and also Section 38(4) of the VAT Act. The position from the central government is you have to pay your taxes in the currency of trade. If you trade in US dollar, pay your tax in that. We believe it's a bad piece of legislation or a provision, given that it's sending a signal to the market that we can't rely on the whole narrative of mouth currency. Because if the narrative of mouth currency was to hold water, surely any currency which is presented should suffice. But the moment you push to say, no, we can't accept a US dollar or a ZIG where US dollar was used, then you are sending a signal to the market that even as the owners of the ZIG, we are not confident enough to hold it when we know you have generated US dollar. So we thought and we feel like this should also be adjusted. And those provisions, in particular 38(4) of the VAT Act and Section 4A of the Finance Act, they require a revision.
Sure. Please join us in the final segment when we bring to a close this week's program, where we have been in discussion with the Chief Executive Officer of the Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Christopher Takunda Mugaga. Welcome back, and to those who are just joining us, tonight we have been discussing the revision of the levies and taxes that were announced by the government this week, and which have actually brought about positivity and a lot of positive vibes among business people and ordinary Zimbabweans, although they would want to see more. And I'm in discussion with the CEO of the Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Christopher Takunda Mugaga. And I'm saying that I was saying that, off air, that I like, Takunda. You were saying something about Takunda.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying, how many are you?
No, Takunda, these are 3 boys who were born same day. So I'm one of them. I'm born a triplet. So there is a Taurai and a Tapua. So it's not accident when you like Takunda. There's a meaning.
Like you guys were born a triplets.
Yes.
Great stuff. Great stuff.
You.
Mr. Mugaga, going into November, I know that a lot of consultations are made by Treasury, where they speak to a number of organizations and different stakeholders before they can actually come up with the draft and eventually the final budget statement. And this year, obviously, is no exception. As the ZNCC, what sort of things would you want to see being captured by the minister, and that would speak to the aspirations of many Zimbabweans, be they business, be they ordinary people?
I think what is important maybe is to witness a legislature which is robust enough to understand its role. Because when you talk of fiscal policy making, it's a process which involves the legislature. I think, remember, there's the finance bill, which then brings what we call the Finance Act. Because the budget, as it is when it's announced, you can't implement it until it is approved by the House, which is both the lower and upper house. So we want to see a stronger legislature which does not make decisions voting on the bill itself, the finance bill, using the political party lines. Because once you use political party lines, it means you're also suffocating the constituents you are representing. They need to have a stronger perspective. Let me give you a picture of a country, Kenya. Kenya, when William Ruto came in as the president of Kenya, one of the first things he wanted to do was to push for what he calls the housing levy, with the expectation of raising equivalents about $2.7 billion US dollars from the market. And it is that bill which led to the mandamanos. When you say mandamanos in Swahili, they are talking of the protests by the Gen Zs or young people, which saw the government of Ruto bring it to a halt the whole finance bill because of activism of civil society and the legislature in Kenya. Donald Trump himself, coming into office, if you remember, his first term prior to his defeat by Biden, he spoke about building a wall with the Mexicans to stop illegal immigrants from Mexico, the neighbor. But if you were to ask yourself how much the war was to cost, $5 billion US dollars, and what is $5 billion US dollars to the federal government of USA? Every 12 hours, USA government spends an average of $5 billion, just 12 hours. But because there's a robust legislature, you couldn't go ahead with the project. It doesn't matter it looked small amount or not. It's the independence of institutions. So we expect that before we even look at the contents of what we expect in the budget. The second issue, it's also important to resolve the exchange rate issue. Remember, we spoke about the issue of either you're paying in ZiG or US dollar. There should not be a difference.
Currency of trade.
Which is the currency of trade. Section 47 of the Reserve Bank Act, it does empower the Minister of Finance to formulate an exchange rate policy which works for the nation. So in other words, before you worry about what is happening at the central bank, it's the duty of the Treasury boss to see an exchange rate which is attractive to business, the constituents I come from, which is also attractive to the common man in the street. I always argue to say Zimbabwe does not have an iota of a challenge regarding forex shortages. If you had to look at the forex generation of this country per capita, you'd be shocked it's almost neck to neck even with bigger economies like South Africa, Nigeria. But it's the forex management system, especially inspired by an exchange rate which is not attractive enough to players, which creates those artificial shortages, I'll call them. So it's a budget we expect to speak alongside an exchange rate which will be as realistic as possible. Because once an exchange rate is not realistic, who would want to look at the ZiG side of the exchange rate or of the budget? No one will talk about it. Even yourself, when the budget is to be announced in ZiG and you have a strong belief that it's wrongly priced the ZiG, the budget will not make sense. It will not make to an investor who wants to come into the country. Then another issue which we believe is an elephant in the room, it borders on what we call the diplomatic approach to doing business, competition. There has been a clarion call without somehow pushing the traces of xenophobia, or some will call it Zionism if it was in Israel. The typical investor, in particular Chinese, there's a strong belief from our constituents that government has not been tough, especially looking at the reserved sectors. Even after slashing the taxes and the levies, if the war competition environment is skewed, especially to foreigners, what you are simply doing is you are saving the foreigners. And worse too, with the rampant smuggling of goods, which is alleged, the keyword being alleged, because it is yet to face the test of the whole court process for someone to catch it. We heard from even legislators talking about lithium minerals being smuggled out of the country with the hope of our other friends from the other country. So when you're talking of a national budget where you know the potential revenue which is supposed to come from your resources alone should be almost 8 billion on top of what you have. And once you fail to harness that potential revenue as smuggling takes place, then you're losing the plot. Even your taxes, your levies will not make a difference. They will just create a hole. The reason why we are afraid of the financial hole created after removing the levies, it's not because there should be a hole, but it's because we are not harnessing enough of our minerals. They are being extricated out of the country in raw state, and that is quite a sad. So it's my hope and fervent belief that the Mines and Minerals Bill, which will lead to the Act as it's discussed right now, will create staying measures on how to avoid leakages, and leakages also across the borders. Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce, in its State of Industry and Commerce Survey of 2024, it pushed out that almost $1.7 billion of smuggled goods are finding their way into this economy and posing unfair competition to the industry, in particular manufacturing, to the extent that even after rebasing GDP, when the figures of manufacturing contribution to GDP were pegged at somewhere around 14.4% of the gross domestic product, the numbers were not necessarily making sense, because we know year on year the sector, which is the manufacturing sector, has been on a very terminal decline. So these are the realities. So before you look at a budget and worry about what should have been added or subtracted, you have to look at the context in which the budget is announced. Corruption, porosity of borders, unfair competition, even in reserved sectors, you see those foreigners dominant, and smuggling of minerals. And lastly, implementation of the budget. If you listen to the mid-term budget, I think we heard Minister Mtuli talking about some ministries not exhausting their budgets. But some of those ministries, they have not been able to carry out the activities they expected of. So you see a culture of what we call the fourth quarter bonanza, where most ministries, when you start wondering why there are so many activities in hotels, including conferences, the last quarter, it's those ministries sometimes trying to exhaust their budgets, which they fail to utilize in a balanced way throughout the year. And I think it's important for that to be monitored going forward.
Sure. Mr. Mugaga, it's always a pleasure having you on this program.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
I've got nothing more to say other than to wish you a very good night and a very healthy next week. Good night.